recorded that answer, but whatever. Cool. Okay, I see the recording sign. So just for those watching at home, I've been sharing a house with my housemates for quite a while. It's about 200 years old and zero sound insulation, which means that in order for me to give this lecture without being shouted at, I have to whisper. So if you're watching this and wondering why I sound like I'm losing my voice, it's because I'm trying to talk as quietly as possible. Okay, so general introductions. My name's Ron. I'm a debater from Bristol. I've achieved some success at debating. There's a couple of topics that I was interested in even before I started debating, and yeah, I think I've done quite well at when they've come up in international trade and monetary theory. There's also some lectures on the channel about international relations. The caveat is I don't study this stuff. I'm a chemistry student. And if you think I've gotten something wrong, there's probably a good chance that I did. So feel free to correct me during this course of this talk. Feel free to ask questions when you think I've inadequately explained something. And if you want to correct me, by all means, don't be embarrassed. Oh no, this is, sorry. I need to stop sharing 1 second, sorry. The presentation has not synced with OneDrive, so I'm staring at an old version of it. Bear with me 1 second. Should be quite easy to fix. Great. Okay, so just quickly outline what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of international trade economics. If you want a really deep explanation of stuff like trade agreements, like different mechanisms or trade areas or the benefits of trade, that's not going to be covered in this talk per se. We'll touch on that stuff, but this is more focusing on the interaction of monetary policy and trade, but obviously we need a fundamental understanding of trade to get there. So that's going to be part of the talk. The next thing is we're talking about the balance of trade and trade policy and what those things mean if you don't know what they mean. Talk about currency valuation. So what it means when you hear Turkey's currency dropped in value or the US dollar's gone up in value. We're going to kind of try and clarify what that means, both, definitionally, but also what consequences that has. And then really the end point of all of this, which is what motivated me to give these 2 talks, the Eurozone, and hopefully making debates about the Euro or other currency unions slightly less torturous to watch. Cool. All right, so international trade. All countries engage in some form of international trade. And ignoring all the economic benefits of it, the reasoning is quite simple, which is that for a lot of countries, the goods that they need are simply not available in their domestic economies. So Singapore just couldn't function without imports, right? It's a tiny little, not an island. Is it an island? Doesn't matter. Doesn't have much farmland, right? It's all developed. Hong Kong is the same. Other countries, though, maybe food, but there's other things they need. So if you want batteries, you need cobalt. 75% of the cobalt in the world is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. France gets 60% of its energy from nuclear power, but it has no uranium. So you have to trade. It's not an option. It's not something you can back out of. There's other instances where it's not that you can't physically access certain goods. It's just that presently they're not made where you are. So classic example of this, it's just been a huge problem for the European Union, is that China is the sole producer in the entire world of certain class of hospital gowns that protect against droplets. So if you wanted to buy those things, you have to trade with China. And basically, the upshot of all this is if you want to have a modern standard of living, you're going to be importing some stuff. But even in instances where you could theoretically produce the good or service in your own country, you may still want to trade. You may still want to import it for other reasons. I mean, simply, firstly, obviously, it might just be cheaper. Often is the case is that it's about environmental damage. So the picture here of the Bagger 288 is as an example of, I don't know if this is actually a Chinese one, but basically China is able to be overwhelming majority, I think it's like 80% of rare earth minerals used to produce things like telecommunications devices, solar panels, basically all sorts of technology, right? Relies on rare earth minerals. China produces 80% of the world's rare earth minerals. The reason is they're basically just willing to strip mine mountain ranges. They will crunch through hundreds of millions of tons of arguably beautiful scenery just to like extract a few kilograms of indium or whatever. Other countries, Canada, for example, could be doing this. They're just not politically, socially, or environmentally comfortable with doing that to their country. So there's reasons like that. It may also just be that your workers are just better employed in other sectors. So a good example of this is that the UK, it could produce more of its own food. The UK could probably be food independent if it wanted to, but the workers that would be required to work in agriculture are just more profitable in financial services or in IT. And so it's better for the UK to simply have its workforce do things like develop software and then use some of that money that they make from selling the software to buy the other things that they need. That's kind of why trade is necessary. Probably this is not too revelationary for anyone, but I thought I'd cover it. Now, the long-term consequence of this is that the global economy gradually optimizes to become more and more efficient. So countries specialize in different goods. So we saw, for example, China used to just produce very cheap, like sort of low-scale manufacturing, things like raw steel, plastic goods, stuff like that. As the country has evolved, that stuff started moving to other countries like Cambodia, like Vietnam, like Ethiopia, and they've started moving into middle-scale manufacturing. And then just over time, kind of the global economy through trade reshapes so that countries that are efficient and are producing things at a competitive price end up producing those things, and other countries specialize in the things that they're better at. Now, obviously, for this to work, it relies on trade always being possible, and that's not in fact the case. By the way, the theory I just described is comparative advantage. So it's the idea that in a well-functioning economy, whether in a country or on a global scale, should have people doing the things that they're good at and providing those things to other people. Now, this requires trade to work, and throughout most of human history, global trade has been a small portion of the global economy because countries, for a variety of reasons, refuse to trade with one another. Now, the important thing to understand here is, and I'm going to cover a concept here. By the way, some of this stuff is going to seem like it's kind of out of order, and it's because I couldn't find a way to, like, too many of these concepts mesh together so thoroughly that I found it nearly impossible to find a sort of logical way of explaining this step by step. So instead, I cover all of the pieces of theory, and we're going to try and bring them together at the end. So it's important to understand that trade doesn't occur through bartering. So it's not like when China's trading with USA, they're not like swapping a shipment of steel for a shipment of, I don't know, iPhones or whatever. They're made in China too. What does the USA produce these days? Missiles, I don't know. The point is, right, it's happening through the medium, and the medium is money. And the money obviously becomes more complicated than the last talk, which focused on a single country, because now we're talking about lots of different countries. So it's going to be important to understand how the different currencies of different countries affect the flow of goods. But the key thing then is, because bartering is not an option, if you want to purchase someone else's foreign goods, if you want to import something, you will need some money, and critically, it would need to be some money that they're willing to accept. Overwhelming majority of the time, this is their domestic currency. So if you want to buy goods from the USA, you'll need US dollars. This requires you to exchange some of your currency for it, and this functions in a somewhat similar manner to, you know, if you've ever gone on holiday and exchanged money, this is basically how it works, just on a grand scale. You go and say, here is some of my pounds, my zloty, whatever country you're in, and they give you whatever currency it is that you want, right? And this is what's happening basically in trade. Now, the issue is, of course, is if you don't engage in trade, if you don't export anything, your country's money is useless to people. There's no reason for them to accept your currency unless they can spend it on something, and that requires you to have something that you're willing to sell. So if you don't export anything, your currency is functionally worthless on the global market, and as a consequence, you also can't import anything. So the two need to be balanced in some respect. So yeah, in order to import, you must, and in the overwhelming, in basically all cases, the balance of exports and imports is not perfect. So this is a little bit strange to think about, but it's a real phenomenon, and we'll sort of explain how it's compensated for. Is that sometimes countries, in terms of the value of the stuff they export or import, the two are not matched. So they maybe sell more goods in monetary terms than they import, or vice versa. So this graph up here shows you the green countries are net exporters. So the value of the goods they export is more than the value of the goods they import. And the general trend, I would say, that you should pay attention to is that rich countries tend to be net importers, and poor countries or developing countries tend to be net exporters. This is obviously not universally true. As you can see, a lot of the poor regions of Central and West Africa are also net importers. There can be reasons for this. For example, if your country simply doesn't produce a lot of essential goods like pharmaceuticals, like heavy machinery, etc., you may be in a situation where you're buying up essential goods in order to prepare for economic development. So, for example, if you wanted to begin manufacturing in a country, the first thing you would need to do is import tons of steel, concrete, heavy machinery, etc., and that would register as a trade deficit. You'd be buying more than you'd be selling. But in the long run, this stuff sort of has to stable out. And critically, at any given moment, the global balance of trade obviously is zero. People aren't giving stuff away, right? So everything that is, if one country is a net exporter, another country must be a net importer. The global average has to balance out. This graph down here is interesting. It's going to give you some idea of where we're going in this talk. And what you'll hopefully notice is France, Italy, Spain, historically sort of relatively stable. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. This is, as I said, it balances out over time. Euro gets introduced. Notice the trajectory of these lines, particularly Germany. So the important thing to take away from this slide is that when we talk about the balance of trade, what we're talking about is the balance of monetary value of goods that flows in and out of the country. And if we sell more than we so if we export more than we import, we would say we have a current account surplus or a trade surplus, right? And the inverse of that is a deficit. Okay, so in the same way in the monetary policy talk, we kind of discussed how central banks coordinate the supply of money and price levels via policy tools, interest rates, printing money, quantitative easing, stuff like that. So in order to understand trade economics, we also understand the tools that countries use when it comes to trade. So what are they? The simplest one is just trade restrictions. So you literally, for example, tell businesses in your country, you are not allowed to sell this to another country. Or you tell people in your country, you're not allowed to buy this from that country. So the most obvious instances where this gets applied are not necessarily as a form of economic policy, but more as a form of foreign policy. So you've heard, for example, like Iran was under heavy sanctions. Venezuela, actually that's not true. Venezuela is not under any sanctions. So that's a bad example. Russia has been under a lot of sanctions from EU and USA as a result of aggression in Crimea. Many countries place sanctions on Israel, for example. So the point is tariffs are the soft touch version. Hard restrictions on trade tend to be something that you don't do to your allies. They tend to be something you do to your political enemies. But the majority of trade barriers are tariffs. So if you're not familiar with the word, a tariff is simply a tax on imports. So like a lorry from one country arrives, they look at the shipment, work out how much it's worth, say, right, you've got to pay this percentage of it as to us as tax in exchange for being allowed to sell it in the country. So to give you an example, if this is maybe too abstract for you, if the USA has a 25% tariff on Canadian cheese, that means a truck comes from the USA to the Canadian border. They open it up. If they see $20 million worth of cheese inside, expensive cheese, I don't know, the company, the Canadian company, presumably, or the shipping company, or whoever is responsible, would have to basically pay the US government $5 million before they would be allowed to sell the cheese. Now, contrary to what some politicians would have you believe, tariffs are not a tax on exporters. So it may be that the Canadian company is the one that pays the tariff, but like they're not taking a hit from it, because they will simply raise the price of the things they sell in order to offset that tax. They have no reason to willingly eat a profit loss for the benefit of the American government, right? So in this instance, for example, probably the most likely outcome is that the Canadian cheese suppliers would raise their prices by 25%. This might have a couple of consequences, and hopefully you'll see now why tariffs become a tool of trade policy. Because the tariff only applies at the border. So it only applies when stuff comes into your country. That means this is not a 25% tax on cheese. This is a 25% tax on Canadian cheese. So maybe consumers start buying American cheese. Or maybe the Canadian farms decide they don't want to pay the tariff, they just don't think it's worth their time, and they just stop exporting entirely. Or maybe customers in the USA decide that they're going to eat less cheese, save money. So no matter what, the point is less Canadian cheese gets bought. And that means Canadian exports into the USA decrease. And so the USA's trade deficit with Canada goes down. And you might imagine if you had a huge trade deficit and you started applying lots of tariffs to lots of different goods, you could massively reduce the amount of imports that you have. Now, the issue is that there's no logical reason to do this in some sense, because tariffs only make goods more expensive or potentially inaccessible for your domestic consumers. So why are tariffs a thing, and why has historically most of human history been characterized by very high tariffs on almost all countries, and as a consequence, very little trade? The obvious one, and the one that probably most people are familiar with, is they took our jobs. Foreign imports, obviously, if they are coming in, presumably they are competing with something that existed before them, and if they're cheaper, the domestic industries die. So a classic example of this was Japanese car exports to the USA when they dropped tariffs following the 70s, something like that. They were just cheaper, they were better quality. They completely crushed a lot of the car manufacturing jobs that existed in the Midwest. A lot of people became unemployed. So the politicians may respond by putting tariffs on a certain good in order to protect jobs, basically, so protect them from competition. There's a really interesting case study where the US Congress passed tariffs on coat hangers, wire coat hangers, because they were being competed with, like, I can't remember, South Africa, I think. I don't remember exactly, but some other country was producing cheaper coat hangers. And the economists did an analysis of this policy, which was intended to save the jobs of coat hanger manufacturers in the USA. And it worked out something like, over the course of like 40 years, the extra amount that the US customers had paid for coat hangers meant that the US government had basically spent like $10 million per job. They could have, instead of passing this policy, they could have simply just taken $10 million out of the treasury and given it to each person that lost their job as a result of the coat hanger. So yeah, tariffs to protect jobs are a political reality. They're very rarely an economic reality. I appreciate that probably someone, at least in the audience, is thinking that I'm just a huge neoliberal and I'm only presenting one side of the argument. And to some extent, that's true. The response may be crushing huge sectors of your economy, i.e. making tens of thousands of people in the Midwest of the USA lose their jobs, might have ramifications. Those local economies collapse, and this is all true. Also, the political risk here is quite severe. You know, if you make a lot of people, the UK saw this in the 80s. They made a lot of manufacturing jobs disappear and ended up with a lot of pissed people who voted out the government. So yeah, the other thing is, as I touched on briefly before, another reason why you use tariffs is to harm another country. So you putting tariffs on them is effectively a sanction on their economy, and it makes them poorer. So it's a good tool of foreign policy, given that you don't have to fire a bullet. Arguably, the consequences are known as damaging. If people lose their jobs, or if the country can't import critical supplies like medicine, manufacturing, whatever, like people can die from other reasons. In some sense, it's not all that different actually to, actually going to war, but it tends to be politically less toxic. You make less enemies on the international stage if you sanction your enemies instead of dropping bombs on them. Another reason you might use, not necessarily tariffs actually, but regulatory controls on imports, is simply because you don't approve of the health standards or environmental standards of another country. So we've had a big debate in the UK, not a debate actually, journalists shouting random shit at one another in Twitter about chlorinated chicken. So in the USA, health standards allow you to wash chicken in chlorine to kill the bacteria. In the UK, this is illegal. And in the European Union, this is illegal. So if the UK does a trade deal with the USA, one of the requirements will be that they have to accept chlorinated chicken. And this has scared a lot of people, probably because the word chlorine sounds scary. In reality, it's because it doesn't matter. We're not going to get into that. Another reason is reciprocation. So if another nation has put tariffs on your exports and sanctioned you, in a lot of instances, it makes sense to sanction them back so that you have leverage in the future negotiation. Otherwise, you're just letting them harm your economy for no real purpose. So a lot of tariffs tend to be retaliatory. The USA puts tariffs on China. China puts tariffs on the USA. Trade war. That's what it means. Cool. Case study. To give you an example of what this actually means for people. So as I said, historically, most countries had very high tariffs on most all goods to try and protect domestic businesses. The UK had the Corn Laws, which are very high tariffs as well as import quotas. So there's a maximum amount of you could import on foreign corn and other grains and stuff like that. And this was basically to protect the rich British landowners who, did all the farming, but were not particularly interested in being efficient or investing in new technologies or just, really doing any hard work. They just wanted to be rich, basically. And so what this meant is over time, the price of corn and grains in the UK gradually went up and up and up relative to France, Spain, other countries. So they put these laws in basically to protect the British farmers. But the consequence of this is that the effective price of bread has massively been increased for the poor, or for everyone actually in the UK, because they could be buying bread for 10% of the price or whatever. I don't remember how big the discrepancy got. It became quite enormous at one point. But they're just basically priced out of doing so by the government's policies. And this famously contributed to the Great Famine in Ireland, because there were lots of, so Ireland at the time was part of Britain, or British Empire, I suppose, which meant they were subject to the same trade law. And so France had tons of cheap bread that they were effectively willing to sell, whether they were willing to sell. There was no shortage of food in Europe, but they couldn't sell it in the UK at prices that people in Ireland, they couldn't sell it in Ireland at prices Irish people could afford because of the tariffs. So as a consequence, there was food that was just going to waste while people died. This led to eventually a sort of bit of a political revolution within the British government, and they repealed the corn laws. Huge drop in food prices. Correspondingly, a lot of British farms went out of business because they just weren't efficient compared to foreign competitors. But it's a good illustration of what poor trade policy looks like. This was a good thing, by the way, repealing the corn laws. Unambiguously good. I will defend that to my death. Cool. So what does this look like? So in this instance, the tariffs were unilateral. So the UK was sanctioning everyone else, basically, but there was no reciprocation. Other countries didn't really care. They didn't need to protect themselves from British grain exports because the British weren't selling them at a competitive rate anyway. In a lot of instances, though, countries will respond with tariffs on things that other countries are good at. So in the Chinese-USA trade war, the USA put tariffs on stuff like washing machines and solar panels and some other stuff. And China responded by putting tariffs on soybeans, and I'm not sure what else. I forget the specifics. There's a lot of stuff. There's documents, huge documents like this, where they're just 15% more on this and 5% more on that, and 50% more on that. And they just basically try and, oh, that was it. I remember a good example. Trying to put tariffs on whiskey, because Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, is from Kentucky, and Kentucky is famously a place where a lot of whiskey is made. So they're trying to put massive tariffs, 50% tariffs on whiskey, so that people would lose jobs, specifically in Mitch McConnell's state, and that would ideally incentivize him to do something about the trade war. We'll see if it works. Cool. So so assuming you start from a point where there is high tariffs on both sides, how do you get rid of them? You engage in a trade negotiation. So these tend to be quid pro quo. So the USA and Japan, for example, might say, the USA agrees to lower tariffs on cars, and they work out, say, if Japan is exporting, $1 billion worth of cars a year, we drop tariffs by 10%, that means you get $100 million more trade. So in return, we want $100 million of tariff reduction in pharmaceutical goods, something like that. So these negotiations tend to be very technical, surprising amount of maths involved. And they also tend to be very, they can get quite heated. There's also all sorts of dirty tricks that experienced negotiators will use, such as making ridiculous offers and then there's a lot of psychology that goes into this. They try and force them to stay in one room for as long as possible so that the negotiators get tired and start agreeing to things they haven't thought through. This is not it's usually not nearly as nice as this photo implies. So as a result, they can take decades. Most trade agreements require minimum several years to be negotiated, even simple ones. Comprehensive trade agreements can take very, very long period of time. One way to mitigate this is to engage in multilateral trading agreements. This is instead of just having two countries coming together and form a trade agreement, you get a whole group of countries come together. And the paradoxically, this actually often makes it simpler, because if like 5 nations want a tariff reduction of 10% on the export of cars, and one nation just really dependent on cars, they now basically get outvoted. So sort of by coming to a comprehensive middle ground that satisfies as many of the participants in the trade agreement as possible, you just end up with overall lower tariffs. And also, it means that smaller countries don't get just outcompeted in a one-to-one negotiation by a big country. So just because I know, by the way, let me pull up the chat. I just want to make sure there's any questions as we go along. Why devaluating your currency makes your exports cheaper and more competitive? Very good question. It's going to be the second half of this talk. So I'm not going to spoil it. Cool. And just in case, because whenever it's like trade, people are always like, what is the WTO? The WTO debates, people are like, I don't know what the WTO is. Okay, so it's a global organization, which almost all countries are a member of, which sets minimum standards on trade. So the WTO will say things like, if you want to export steel anywhere in the world, you have to take these precautions to ensure that your steel is safe. It's not just going to crumple. If you export food, you have to make sure that it's free of parasites or viruses or whatever. But it also sets minimum tariffs, so maximum tariffs. So if you're a member of the WTO, there'll be certain things that you're just not allowed to exceed tariffs on. Typically, it's essential things: food, medicine, steel. So the idea is that by keeping everyone at a common trading level, it prevents this kind of like trade war, beggar thy neighbor style policies. It sort of binds everyone to a minimum standard, which is not too free trade, if that makes sense as an adjective. But it's also not too restrictive. You can, of course, go below the WTO requirements. So the WTO tariff, maximum tariff on grain, might be like 10%. There's nothing stopping you having a trade agreement that you drop that to 5%. It's just a minimum base, or a maximum in some sense. They also arbitrate trade disputes. So if one country is, for example, doing something to improve their economic standing or improve their trading situation against another country in a way that is shady, they'll take that to WTO. I'm not going to cover examples of that, but if you go away and read about this, trade disputes, there's lots of good examples. The WTO is global, but as I said, it's just the starting point. There's lots of more comprehensive free trade areas that exist. So famous one that probably relevant for most of us is, of course, the European Common Market, which includes all the EU members. Actually, it includes some non-EU members. It includes Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland. NAFTA, so that's actually it's called something different now. They've renegotiated it recently, but that's Canada, the USA, and Mexico. Mercosur, which is the South American trade area, except Venezuela, they got boosted out. So this picture's actually out of date. Because, as I say, trade, often tool of foreign policy. ASEAN, also trade area. TPP was supposed to have the USA in it. Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's called. It basically is, hopefully you can see these countries in, the countries in brown are ASEAN. The TPP countries aren't listed on this, but yeah. So what free trade areas do is the African Union is in the process of negotiating a series of regional trade agreements. It's like West African Trade Agreement, South African Trade Agreement. They're aiming by, I think, 2023 to have a continental-wide African trade agreement. So that would basically have tariff-free trade across all of Africa. I think it would become the largest common market in the world by the time it's implemented. Yeah, cool. All right, now let's get on to, sorry, my participants list is blocking my view. Okay, cool. Let me just check comments. One question, are rich countries basically getting poorer because you said they have a negative, you've written BOP, I assume you mean BOT, balance of trade. So are rich countries basically
balance of payment, but I guess they're the same thing. It's just another term.
Some of the stuff will hopefully become clearer, because I understand what you're saying. It sounds like if you're importing more than you're exporting, eventually you're going to run out of money. We're going to cover why that's often not the case. Okay, so at this point then, hopefully, and the questions indicate that this is where people are thinking, you may be wondering, well, what happens if you do run a trade deficit or surplus? Where does that difference go? So the important thing, and the thing that binds these two lectures together, is to remember that money is the buffer. It's the middle ground that happens, that makes trade possible. And it also means that you can defer consumption. So you can put off buying stuff till later, or you can hold money, or you can run debts, lots of things like that. So lots of mechanisms that money allows you to sort of massage the gaps in between perfect exchange. So, as I said, when a country imports, they swap some of their currency for goods and services. But if they import more than they export, they're running a trade deficit. And that, what the consequence of that means is that more of your currency is now flowing out into the world, and you're getting goods in return. So in some sense, if you could perpetually run a trade deficit, so if you could run, if you could have a trade deficit with zero consequences, that'd be great. You're just basically handing out worthless pieces of paper to companies all around the world, and in return, you're getting actual good stuff. In practice, there's obviously impossible to keep going forever, but that's the consequence of a trade deficit. More of your currency ends up in the global market, and money, currencies obey the rules of supply and demand, just like everything else. So if there's a surplus of your currency elsewhere in the world on currency markets, that means that the value of the currency goes down because it's easier to acquire. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. It's really important if it doesn't. And if you haven't seen the monetary theory lecture, maybe this will be a little bit too much of a leap for you. So yeah, so then, okay, cool. So let's press on here. So here's a case study. The UK has historically had a reasonably tight trade balance. So the blue line here is the net trade balance of trade. At various points, though, this has dipped. So these two graphs don't perfectly line up, unfortunately. But you can see here, for example, that the value of the British pound reaches a peak right at the point in the 1980s when the balance of trade is positive. So just as British exporting is really starting to grow quite rapidly, correspondingly, the value of the British currency goes up because if the currency can buy more useful stuff, there's more of an incentive to acquire that currency. And so the consequence, the value of the currency goes up. Supply and demand. Again, put it in the comments if this is not making perfect sense to you. Yeah, there was some other ones. So we can see here, though, that as through the 1980s to the 1990s, as the trade deficit begins to grow, the value of the currency begins sliding down. And in the 2000s, something interesting happens, which is that a huge current account deficit, a huge trade deficit begins to appear, like -6% lately. It's not good. But the currency doesn't really move until 2008, when suddenly investors, so basically I think the sentiment in global markets was like, oh, it will recover at some point, they'll start exporting more. So they kept holding the currency, waiting for the British, because it was assumed that kind of it's the UK, it's famous historical country, surely at some point they'll get their shit together and fix the economy. And they didn't. And then eventually in 2008, during the financial crisis, investors were like, oh wow, okay, no, this is permanent, and then the currency crashes. So remember, markets are not just perfect transmission mechanisms, or people's sentiments feed into them. And if people believe that the trade deficit will recover, they'll hold the currency waiting for it to recover. So yeah, currency shifts are tied to the UK's trade balance, although, as you can see, obviously this is not one-to-one correspondence, there's imperfections. You'll notice, for example, there was a big crash here in 2016 in the value of the British pound that's not really connected to any change in the current account deficit. That's the Brexit vote. And that's, again, because Brexit obviously means the UK is leaving the free trade area of the EU, and as a result, they won't be able to sell as much, export as much stuff. All right, currency valuation. So I've said that markets exist and they trade currencies, and the relative value of currencies is known as currency valuation. So it's like, how many euros can I get for a pound? How many dollars can I get for a yen? Stuff like that. And much like a stock market, the foreign exchange market is largely driven by speculation. So investors don't wait for the economy of a country to change before they sell or buy the currency. They try and make predictions. So if you expect a country's economy to grow very fast in the future, and that means they're going to be exporting more, and there's going to be more demand for the stuff they're selling, it's very logical for you to buy up the currency preemptively so that you can then sell that currency to people at the point at which they need to buy stuff from that country. Similarly, if you think that a country's economy is going to slump or go into recession, you know that means there's going to be less demand for their goods, and that means the currency is going to be worth less. So, for example, the net oil exporters outlook right now probably doesn't look great. So, if you're a currency investor, you maybe don't want to be holding many, whatever the Saudi currency is, for example, or Russian currency, because it's not going to be useful to you. Now, conversely, though, powerful economies like the USA can sustain very large trade deficits for very long periods of time. In fact, the USA is probably the only big economy that can do this. Other countries like Switzerland can also get away with this, and the UK has somewhat done this in the past. But basically, the USA can run a huge trade deficit and not devalue their currency, because people will always want US dollars because it's seen as like a reliable currency. And that means if you're like a, I don't know, Ethiopian businessman doing trade in Myanmar, you can probably use the US dollar. Like, it's not either your country's currency, but you both recognize that it's a good currency and will buy stuff that is valuable on the global market. So that's why, despite the fact that the USA runs a trade deficit, speculators keep the currency level high because they think that that money will still be useful in the future. So at this point, now we're going to move into, and this is going to start answering the question of the relationship between money and trade more directly, I guess. So this is just a quick recap of some of the stuff we talked about last time. So firstly, money is an accounting device. It's a way of keeping track of supply and demand and the ratio of the two, and sets price levels. So if you increase the amount of money, but you don't change the amount of production, the cost of things goes up. Conversely, if you decrease the amount of money, but you maintain the same amount of supply, the price levels, the price of things you'd see on the shelf would begin to go down, or inflation is more commonly the case. So as I explained in the lecture, central banks tend to keep inflation, like a small amount of inflation, and they do this via a variety of complex mechanisms that we're not going to go over again, but they all center around the same core principle, which is if you want to cause inflation, you increase the money supply. If you want to cause deflation, not that you would ever want to cause deflation, but if you want to reduce the level of inflation, you would shrink the money supply. Okay, so one of the things I didn't talk about last time is the consideration that central bankers have, like people who conduct monetary policy, when they think of foreign exchange. So bearing in mind that the money supply of a country doesn't stay within the country itself, some of it leaks into the global economy. I guess I'm going to ask two questions. One, what effect might expansionary monetary policy, right, increasing the money supply, have on the relative value of your nation's currency? And also, I guess, as a second question, how does money leak into the global economy? So let's take a minute and see what answers people can come up with. If you think you have an answer to either question, feel free to unmute yourself and we'll start chatting. Be a bit less lonely than me talking to the void.
So with regards to the expansionary monetary policy, so an expansionary policy.
If no one knows, or if I explain the question poorly. So if the central bank works to increase the money supply, what do you think would, like, let's use an example. Let's say the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the USA, increases the money supply in the USA of the dollar. One, how does that leak out into the global economy? And two, what effect might that have on the value of the dollar against the euro, for example?
Yeah. So I guess if I understand what you mean, I guess the way that it would leak out into the global economy is that essentially people or businesses.
Okay. Well, this was a doomed exercise. Wait.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just saw it flash up saying Gwen was talking, but I didn't hear anything. So, do you want to try again?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I'm not sure what to do here.
Are you
yeah, I
able
can
to
see
hear
it flashing
anyone?
yellow, but I can't hear you. Are you sure your microphone?
Can you hear anyone, Ron?
If you fiddle around with your Zoom settings, so if you open up the bar at the bottom, there's an arrow next to mute. You can probably adjust the audio settings. Just make sure that you're. Oh, the problem's on my end. That would explain a lot. Okay, can someone try talking now?
Hello.
Hello?
Okay. God, I hate technology. Let me... Okay. Can anyone hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can someone try speaking again?
We can hear you.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay. Yeah, no, I know you guys could hear me, but I was hoping I'd fix the problem of why I can't hear anyone else. Is it because... Sorry, I'm just going to try one thing and then... Okay, so it's just Zoom. Everything else on my computer is working fine. Let's try one last thing. Can someone try speaking one last time and then...
Hello, can you hear me?
What about now?
Type out your answer then. While you type out, I'm going to have a last stab at seeing if I can fix this. Yeah, so Gwen, that is correct. So I've now, just by the way, I've now hooked up my speakers to my Bluetooth. Sorry, my laptop's a Bluetooth sound system. So can someone try saying something again one more time?
Hello.
What about now? Can you hear us?
Probably have to restart Zoom or something. Okay, yeah. So US consumers get more money, start buying stuff from outside the USA, dollars flow out. In terms of how expansionary monetary policy affects currency valuation, increasing your monetary supply, some of that leaks out into global markets. More of your currency in global markets, your currency becomes worth less. So if you, from the last lecture, remember everything I talked about in terms of stimulating your economy via monetary policy, bear in mind one of the things that's going to do is going to devalue your currency. But that might be a good thing, as we're about to cover. So the first thing I want to cover is how central banks actually coordinate monetary policy, but when they're not interested in changing the money supply in their own country, but they want to affect the value of their currency on the global marketplace. So sometimes you want to deliberately control it. So the way you do this is, if your currency is overvalued, you think your currency is too expensive. Now that might not seem like a problem. I'm going to explain in a minute why that is a problem. But if your currency is overvalued, you just print more of it and go out into currency markets and basically swap your currency for other people's currency. So what that does is pulls other countries out of currency market, other countries' currencies out of circulation. So you let's say you're Switzerland, right? And you're buying up. What is the Russian currency, by the way? I don't know why I don't know this. If someone wants to type it out, it's kind of bugging me that I can't remember it. Yeah, so you're Switzerland, ruble. Okay, great. That rings a bell. So you're Switzerland, you print some francs, buy some rubles, less rubles on the currency market, ruble value goes up, Swiss franc goes down. Hopefully this makes sense. Chat, put in the chat if you're not 100% clear on this. In the process of doing this, so obviously you start to accumulate foreign reserves. So the central bank is you in this case. You're now sitting on piles of currency from other countries, This is called foreign reserves. And this is useful in that you generally want to maintain some foreign reserves because you want to be able to, you want to have the money on hand ready when you want to trade. Alternatively, though, maybe you think your currency is undervalued and you want to push it up. The way you do that is you sell your foreign reserves. So that means you are buying up your own currency off currency markets and then pulling it back into your country. Now, the prerequisite for that, of course, is that you need to have foreign reserves in the first place. If you're in a situation where your currency is undervalued and you don't have foreign reserves and you want to increase its value, you're out of luck. Bite the bullet. Okay, so you're probably wondering now, why does currency valuation matter? And this is now going to address the question I got earlier, which is, I'm going to read out the question because we're going to answer it directly. Why devaluing your currency makes your exports cheaper and more competitive? Okay, let's cover this now. Because trade occurs across currencies, the relative value of two currencies directly translates to the cost of the goods and the services. So what this means is, if I have, you've experienced this if you've gone on holiday and your currency's changed before you got to the airport or whatever. If your country's currency goes up in value a lot, that means it's gone up relative to another country's, and that means that your £1 or $1 or 1 ruble or 1 euro's worth of income is now perhaps worth 10% more in that country. So that means you can buy 10% more of their stuff. So if the value of a currency goes down, that the inverse applies. Your income now buys less stuff from that country. So as a result, a high value currency means that you can import more, but it also means that you export less because your exports become more expensive for people in other countries. Does that make sense? Like, hopefully I've explained this in a way that illustrates, and sorry, the key distinction is, type out if you want me to go over that in more detail, if you have any specific questions on that. But the key thing to note here is that the change is always relative to the global economy. So if the US dollar goes up in value or down in value by 10%, that does nothing to people in the USA. It does nothing to change the flow of trade within the USA. A dollar will still buy a dollar's worth of stuff at your local supermarket, same with the euro, whatever, right? All it changes is imports and exports, right? So the fluctuations in exchange rates of currencies affect trade, but they don't affect the internal economy, or at least not immediately, right? So that's why, for example, currency manipulation, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, is important, but it's also why the monetary policy of a central bank always has to be coordinated, not just with respect to your own economy, but with respect to other economies. So if, for example, you're in a recession and the central bank engages in expansionary monetary policy, i.e. they print lots of money or create money in some other mechanism, like quantitative easing, and that devalues your currency, suddenly for everyone in that country, imports just became more expensive. That matters a lot when you consider that, for example, you might be importing stuff like essential supplies for your industry, you might be importing medicine, you might be importing food. There's lots of considerations that if you just devalue your currency in the pursuit of more exports, whatever, you also have to consider what that's doing to your imports, right? So monetary policy and trade literally go hand in hand, because people will always buy the cheapest thing, and the change in a currency, even despite nothing changing about the actual economic output of a country, just the change in the currency can translate into changes in trade. So no one's typed any comments, so I assume that explanation was sufficiently clear. So given therefore what I've just explained, which is that currency and currency valuation has a massive impact on trade, the obvious conclusion to this is there's also an incentive to manipulate currency valuation. So you may have heard Trump claim that China is engaging in illegal currency manipulation. And to be clear, it is in fact illegal to do this. The World Trade Organization specifically bans currency manipulation because, and this is a good example of why, in the 20th century, as the Chinese economy starts to grow and grow, you can see the value of the currency starts going up and up and up. Why is this? Because investors see the Chinese economy, they see it's increasing, they see it's growing, and they're like, okay, cool, they're going to be producing twice as much stuff in 10 years. I can buy currency now, and in 10 years, it's going to be worth a lot in terms of Chinese goods. I see now there's a comment. Is the propensity of a country's internal prices economy changing dependent on the sort of industry the country relies on. Devaluation for a first world exporter might not affect them directly. Yes, perfect. When we talk about Germany, this is going to be a really good case example for this. The changes in currency valuation affect different countries in different ways, yeah. Okay, so you see here, the Chinese currency is like just absolutely shooting up. And then I can't remember exactly what happened in '95, but basically it was like a bunch of investors were placing what functioning equivalent in financial markets to bets on the Chinese currency that would go up and pushed up the value a lot. And the Chinese central bank stepped in and just went, nope. And notice here that it's almost artificially, well, it's artificial, but it's almost at 8, just over, I think it was like 8.1. For a very long period of time, 10 years. It's a very unnatural graph to see when it comes to anything in economics, and that's because the central bank was doing exactly what I described previously. Whereas the currency, if they noticed that over the course of a month, the currency was going down in value, they would buy up yen from abroad using foreign reserves, and inversely, if they noticed that the currency was increasing in value, they would sell yen, print yen, or whatever. So they built up huge foreign reserves doing this, and they were able to keep the. So imagine this trajectory continues going up. Maybe by 2005, the yen is actually worth something like 50. US dollars to China. Yeah, you get the idea. Anyway, cool. So, why this is actually illegal to manipulate currency value like this? Because you think of the extreme case that I could do. I could basically pump up the value of my currency for like a month, buy up loads of stuff that I needed, and then allow the currency to drop back down in value afterwards, having already bought everything I wanted. Because the key reason why this is illegal is because the country that's doing the currency manipulation is the one that knows where the direction of the value of their currency is going. And that means that they can basically give themselves an advantage. Another way this might work, for example, is if you want to export more, you can basically keep, as what China did, right? They keep the value of their currency low, and then as a result, their exports become cheaper relative to their competitors, countries like Vietnam, like Cambodia. So that meant that China is, without actually being more efficient at economic production, is able to make their goods cheaper and like crowd out other countries. Okay, so in the absence of and now we're going to get onto stuff that's really like directly relevant to the Eurozone. This is going to cover what should happen. In the absence of currency manipulation, currency value acts as a stabilizer for a country's economy. Can anyone figure out what I mean by this? And unfortunately, the answer is I'm going to let you think about it for 30 seconds, but because I can't have you talk, then we can't really have a Q&A about this. But take a second, think about how the currency valuation, given the last couple of slides, how it might stabilize an economy. Perfect. Very good, Gwen. Gwen, do you study economics, or are you just like really understanding this stuff? Okay, I'm going to take, don't study economics. Okay, just well read, good. Or I'm explaining it well. Believe what you will. Have nerdy friends, okay, that makes sense. All right, so yeah, here's how it goes. Country experiences economic shock, goes into recession, markets sell off its currency because it's in a recession, it's going to produce less. Why would we, this currency is not going to be useful. This decreases the value of the currency. Lower value currency, exports cheaper, more competitive. People buy more exports, or maybe they invest more, buy up real estate in that country, stuff like that. And then that increases the money flowing into the economy. It means more people want to buy their stuff. This revitalizes businesses. People get money from exporting, stuff like that. Brings them out of the recession, revitalizes the economy. The economic recovery now means that the currency, there is a demand for the currency, its value recovers, stabilizes. Obviously, this is as much of a mechanism for instability as it is for stability, because it means if you're because it's not one way responsive, right? It might also mean that, for example, people see you have a some sort of civil unrest, or some people in an election ends up being very tense. So investors go, don't like the look of that, and they start selling off the currency. That can affect a current country's economy just on the basis of the sentiment of the global community. This is also why explicit currency manipulation is not allowed, but you're allowed to stabilize your currency. So central banks will typically try and massage out big peaks and troughs in currency valuation because you generally want a stable currency level, so that if you do a deal with someone, you say, look, I'm going to buy 100 crates of carrots from you next month. You kind of want to know how much that's going to cost you in a month's time. And if the currency is zigzagging all over the place, it can be very hard to do trade. You may just decide to trade with someone else rather than risk, supply chain falling through because the currency devalued because a politician said something stupid on Twitter or something like that. So yeah, currency unions and the euro. So for the reason I just outlined, that a stable currency between two countries is good for trade, it kind of makes sense that you would think that for a big trade area like the EU, where they're all in a common market together, why not just bypass currency markets entirely? Why not just have the same currency? And then you don't have to be wasting effort or, trying to manage your currency price level. You're also not reliant on the sentiments of global currency investors for whether or not your economy survives or not. Kind of makes sense to be in a currency union, right? So there's a couple of ways to do this. So one is an informal currency union. It's like in Zimbabwe, where the Zimbabwe dollar became worth less than the paper it was printed on. So people just started trading in the US dollar. I mean, Zimbabwe was in a functional currency union with the USA. It's kind of weird to think about, but happens more often than you think. It could be a formal currency union, but without policy coordination. This is called a peg. So this is where, for example, one country will say, we're going to just lock our currency at this level relative to another country. So this might make sense, for example, if Canada and the USA, like the majority of trade between one another, it makes sense for Canada to be like, we're just going to peg our currency value at the same, or not necessarily 1-to-1 with the US dollar, but maybe like 2-to-1, whatever makes sense to them, right? And that way you can be sure that the price levels stay constant. And they do that by changing the supply of foreign reserves, like I explained previously. And then lastly, the common policy is where you share monetary policy. So that's where you do all the stuff I talked about in the last lecture together. So the European Central Bank conducts monetary policy, interest rates, quantitative easing, all this stuff for the entire monetary union, the entire Eurozone. In some sense, also the US dollar is also a currency union, if you think about it, because each US state is the size of a normal country and has an economy of a similar size and diversity to a normal country. So in some sense, the US dollar is also, and also all the other informal countries that use the US dollar, which is a lot of countries, believe it or not. A lot of trade across the world is done in the US dollar because people don't trust other currencies to stay stable. So what are the advantages? So I mean, I've covered all this stuff, so I'm going to race through it quite quickly. But the first one is it eliminates exchange rate risk. So it's because there's time delays in trade. You don't want to be disrupted by fluctuations in currency. So joining monetary policy has a massive benefit there. So first, it also just speeds up transactions. So if you say to someone, oh, this is really good for so a lot of the the European Union economy is based around like high-tech manufacturing and just in time. So it's things like you'll get an order for, I don't know, some company will be like, we need we need airplane part by Friday. And you're like, I mean, they've got to buy 637 components from 18 different countries by tomorrow evening and get them assembled. If you've got to swap tons of currencies and deal with lots of different financial systems, it's going to slow you down a lot. Fast transactions can be a big deal for economies. Price transparency as well. If you are looking for somewhere to open up a factory, it's much easier to compare euros in Spain, euros in Netherlands, than it is to try and figure out what those relative currencies mean and how much it's going to cost you in the long run, particularly because if you're a foreign company and the price level of those countries changes, then you may end up paying your workers more or less, right? You also, There's less risk of financial and monetary crises, sharing with some sort of risk. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. It's also just obviously more border trade, but tourism, like it's not a negligible thing. Tourism, it forms 20% of the economy of Croatia, for example. I do see that there's questions. I'm going to come to in the end because I want to keep this from being too long, and I want to get through to this stuff about Southern Europe and the Eurozone. So, downsides. Quite obviously, one size fits all doesn't work if you're not all the same size. So country A, Italy, right now, maybe, is in a recession. Country B, I don't know, Germany, growing. How do you get monetary policy that fits both of them, right? On one, you want to be increasing the money supply. On the other one, you want to be decreasing it. The other thing is that a lot of the stuff, by the way, this was intended to be on the end of the last lecture, and I moved it to here at the last minute. So a lot of the stuff is going to talk about mechanisms that were covered in the first lecture. So if this is not making sense, maybe you're on YouTube, pause it, go watch the other one, come back. This stuff will make more sense. I'll do my best to explain as I go along for those who are watching live today. So the interconnectedness of financial systems also increases the risk, because banks will try and invest in lots of different countries to try and spread their risk. But that means that one country going bust, or a couple of countries going bust, can affect the economies in other countries in ways that they wouldn't necessarily normally. And it also means, for the exact reason I described earlier, which is that you get to compare prices across different regions. It means if one region is less productive, less efficient at producing certain things, all the capital just flies away from that area. Okay. So you may have heard, and actually, I mean, this is an argument, and I use argument in the loosest possible sense. By the way, if you think I'm referring to you here, I'm probably not, but I've watched a lot of bad debates on the euro. So you hear things like, or just a normal conversation, right? It's like, you can't have a monetary union without a fiscal union. What is that? Well, it's because if a country is in a recession and they can't use monetary policy to fix their economy, that means they're forced to use fiscal policy, borrowing money, basically. So I imagine there's going to be a bunch of debates coming up on Corona bonds, stuff like this, right? Well, the problem is, normally what Italy and Spain and France would do right now is that they would cut interest rates, boost money supply via a lot of the policy mechanisms I talked about last time. They can't. The European Central Bank controls the monetary policy, and it has to take into account however many members of the euro there are right now, right? It can't set them in a way that will just benefit Italy and Spain, because they're all sharing the same currency, and that currency flows across borders. So in the USA, this works because rich USA states finance poor ones. So California basically pays for Alabama to keep functioning, but that means that Alabama is stabilized. If they go into recession, they don't necessarily drag down California because the money flows from one to the other. There's lots of complicated laws basically that ensure that this money gets fairly distributed. Fairly, I mean, depends what you mean by fair, right? But so yeah, the euro is not fantastic. It has a lot of benefits. So this is going to be very negative. There's a lot of benefit. This is glossing over all of the benefits that I've talked about earlier, which have been absolutely massive for a lot of countries, and we don't know the counterfactual. Maybe these countries would have struggled anyway. The consensus, I think, amongst most monetary economists is that the euro has not been great for Southern Europe and has been very good for Northern Europe. Why is this the case? Well, when they joined, they were already different economic circumstances. Northern Europe was industrialized, well-developed, was producing lots of goods that ended up being very important for the global economy in the future. So the UK, for example, was leading the world basically in legal and financial services, which became really important as the global economy got more interconnected. Germany was doing like technical high-skill manufacturing, became really important as things like aviation became more common, or car ownership went up, etc. The stuff that Southern Europe was doing, it's not that they got less valuable, they got relatively less valuable. So Southern Europe was producing a lot of like lower skill manufacturing, a lot of farming, stuff like that. A lot of that stuff, either agriculture, very stable, like the demand for food grows with population. It can't like grow faster than that, right? Whereas a lot of the other stuff they were producing, textiles, for example, all went to Bangladesh. So the monetary policy can't now account for the differences between these two countries. Those stabilizers I talked about before can't kick in because the euro is pegged at a single price level. So what should be happening, should have happened basically for the last decade, arguably 15 years, is that the currencies of Southern European economies should have been decreasing and making their exports cheaper to compensate for the relative inefficiency. But instead, they've been locked at the level of the sort of average of the euro, which is, I think I've duplicated that slide. Yeah, so, but in the same way that Southern European economies have suffered because they've had to export less because their exports have become more expensive, Northern Europe has benefited immensely because they can basically export more. And note, this is the key thing I pointed out earlier. If the euro goes down in value, it's undervalued relative to what it should be, that has nothing to affect German citizens who are buying stuff from shops. And it particularly doesn't do anything to affect German citizens when a lot of the stuff they're buying is from Southern Europe and its prices are being depressed by the poor economic situation. So I'm going to, please ask like in the chat if some of this hasn't made sense, but hopefully with the context of sort of all the explanation I gave before, the euro has effectively functioned as a way of making Northern Europe's economies more export competitive globally and within the Eurozone, and it done the exact inverse to Southern European economies. Now, the only way for these countries, the only way for Southern European economies to stay afloat basically then is to spend more to boost their economies through fiscal policy, which is the other arm of economics. That's tax and spend and borrow money and spend, stuff like that, right? So if you can't inject money into your economy through monetary policy, you just have to borrow. Or massive cuts in spending, which have their own problems, not least that they're politically toxic. For context, Greek pensions at the start of the Greek crisis, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, were in real monetary terms almost equivalent to German pensions, despite the fact that the GDP per capita of Greece was more than 50% lower. And then they just couldn't cut them because any party that went and stood up and said, yeah, we have to cut pensions because the euro has made our exports uncompetitive, it's not really going to fly. On the flip side of this coin, Germany has been making bank. So Germany has the largest trade surplus in the world. It means the relative value of their exports compared to their imports is the biggest in the world. And that includes China, a country with 17 times the population, 3.5 times the GDP, right? So, and the way Germany is able to do this, and no, by the way, that export surplus is effectively just money being funneled into the German economy that normally would be compensated by a rise in the value of the German currency, making their exports less competitive, but instead that's not happening because it's capped by the Southern European economies. So Germany has been able to run a huge budget surplus as well, where the government borrows or spends less money than they borrow and is paying down their debts. And this is the exact inverse of Southern Europe, who have seen their debts just grow and grow because they have to spend money to keep their economies afloat. And yeah, I'm repeating myself, but I'm hoping that this is going to be really clear. Okay, so Greece is, I've talked about it a bit, but it's a good case study because it illustrates some of the mechanisms of what happens when this stuff goes really wrong. So they kept borrowing money to keep the economy afloat for as long as possible. And eventually, look, we'll be honest, right? Like the reality is there was also a lot of fiscal mismanagement. As I pointed out earlier, the pensions is a good example of the way in which Greece was genuinely overspending, right? And you know, they were not great at tax collection, and there was a lot of corruption. But the scale of the economic harm, and also the fact that this has affected a lot of other countries, even countries that you wouldn't think of as being Southern European, countries like Ireland also suffered as a result of this sort of mismatch of monetary policy without financial compensation through the EU, like you would get in the USA. So Greece did some stuff wrong, but the scale of economic harm completely disproportionate. So yeah, eventually they couldn't service their debts. No one was willing to lend them money, basically. Normally a government goes to investors and says, hey, can we borrow some money and we'll give you it back in 10 years with like 5% interest or whatever. And if the investors think it's risky, they'll be like, I'll do it for 10% interest. In this instance, investors were like only willing to lend to Greece at like 15% a year interest at this point because they were like, the risk here is just too high. This country is going to go bust unless something radically changes. And it didn't seem like it was going to. So no one would lend Greece money, basically. So they were in a bit of a hole, and the EU was like, well, we're not just going to hand you money, because you've also, as I said, there's a lack of willingness to address the extent to which the euro has been a mechanism of wealth redistribution in Europe, because it's benefiting the rich Northern European economies as much as it's harming the poor Southern ones. And the way the EU works is by consensus. So as long as half the EU doesn't want to change the status quo, it's not going to really be fixed until a big enough crisis forces them to do something about it. So the EU wasn't willing to give Greece money, and they also weren't willing to lend them money unless they agreed to radically overhaul their economy in terms of how much they were spending and stuff like that. So Greece eventually came together with a group of different actors and just agreed to a bailout package, but it was very strict in terms of austerity and requiring them to cut spending. And so this led to a political crisis as well, and the whole thing became a huge mess. So here's what normally would happen if we weren't in a currency, or if Greece wasn't in a currency union. So normally what you would do is, I'm using the word print money here, but if you watch the monetary theory lecture, you'll see that it's a bit more complicated than literally just money printer go brrr. But it's it's analogous, right? So what you do is you print money, you use that to fund day-to-day spending, government employees, wages, unemployment, stuff like that. This gives you inflation, but as long as you do it sensibly and don't end up in hyperinflation, inflation can be a good thing, because inflation, not good, but good to get out of a recession, because higher inflation means that people's debts go down. So things like people's car loans, their mortgage loans, etc. Inflation makes those loans smaller relative to their income. And so as a consequence, it's a way of sort of erasing your debt. Obviously, if you do this too much, as Argentina has now defaulted more than any other country in human history, I think, just in the last 50 years or something. So now it's almost impossible for them to borrow money from anyone, because people are just like, well, you're just going to default and inflate away your debt again. But normally, sort of one-off crisis, kind of like Greek had, that's what you would do. But obviously the ECB wasn't willing to do that, because if the ECB printed, not literally printed again, but metaphorically printed enough money to boost the money supply in Greece in order to inflate away their debts, well, the rest of the EU now also has to deal with enormous amounts of inflation. And there's not even any guarantee that the money that you pump into Greece stays in Greece. More likely, it just flows out into those other countries. So you probably don't even get inflation or boost of the money supply in Greece, but you definitely harm the rest of the EU. So this is why the ECB was not, the European Central Bank was blamed for the crisis, but in some sense there wasn't really anything they could do. They were basically in a catch-22, and only the EU Parliament could do anything about this. In terms of what they needed, basically, was fiscal redress. They needed money to be taken out of rich Northern European economies and put into Greece. So what might happen if Greece defaulted, and why was that something that the EU was even still eventually willing to come to a deal with them on to avoid? So the first thing is, Greek banks would be, if Greece defaults, this is, there's ways to manage it. It's like going bankrupt, but one of the things that you do is basically everyone refuses to lend you money, or stops engaging in finance with you. And so Greek banks would have all catastrophically failed. Without Greek banks to provide, okay. So my computer makes noise, just not from Zoom. So yeah, without credit, a lot of Greek businesses would have failed, and in turn that would have harmed Greek banks more. And then, because of what I said earlier, just that the EU connects the financial system of all these countries, the Eurozone connects the financial system of all these countries, that meant you had German and Italian and Spanish and British and Irish and just financial institutions and banks in all different countries who had investments in Greece. So Greece collapsing also fucked over a lot of other would have also fucked over a lot of other countries. And this would have basically spread. So the recession could have ended up harming the whole of the EU. While it wouldn't have harmed the rest of the EU as much as it harmed Greece, the risk was that if the EU allowed one country to fail, there was no reason to believe that they wouldn't allow future countries to fail. And that meant that people were not looking at Greece and the Eurozone saying, how is the EU going to manage this? Because if they get this wrong, Italy's next. And when Italy goes down, Spain goes down. And when Spain goes down, by that point, fully a third of the Eurozone economy is going to Greece lost something like 30% of GDP during this crisis, right? If this had spread to the whole of the EU, we're talking about like 40 years worth of economic growth in Europe wiped out. So that's why they couldn't just let it default, and also why if you were at Athens Euros, I think that the final was not balanced. Cool. So what could Greece have done if they weren't shackled, or what could they have done within the context of what they were allowed to do? So one thing that was being floated around was that they would ditch the euro and go back to the drachma. But that would require completely swapping over their currency, and it would also destroy global faith in the euro. So remember what I said, currency is not just purely the exchange, it's also how much people think it's going to be worth in the future. If you're holding a pile of euros, metaphorically, you're an investor, and you've just seen what is 3.5-ish% of the Eurozone leave the euro, that's 3.5% less exports that suddenly your euros can buy. And that's maybe not such a big deal. But if you think that this is likely to spread, and that Italy is about to also swap out of the euro, and Spain is about to swap out of the euro, and Portugal is about to swap out of the euro, you're facing a situation where the euros you hold are worth very little 10 years down the road. So you sell them now. So if the Eurozone crisis had persisted, the crisis would have basically devalued the euro for the rest of the Eurozone. Note that has less of a harm for Germany, maybe, because they're a net exporter, but they still import some stuff. They still had to buy pharmaceuticals from Britain. They still had to buy, manufacturing equipment from the USA, or software from the USA, or stuff like, steel from China, right? But it would also have harmed the other countries that were net importers, because now their currency is worth even less than it already was, which is too low. Which was, it's basically like, you get the idea, imports become more expensive. Sorry, I'm getting tired. This talk has gone on for a long time, so I'm going to start to wrap up now. Actually, I think this is one of the last slides. So yeah, in the end, it was a situation that neither side could afford for Greek default. Oh yeah, the other thing is they could have, so there's a branch of the ECB in each country, because if Greece suddenly needs, Greek banks suddenly need an extra 10 million euros to cover people's just withdrawing money or transactions or whatever, it's insane to think that you ring up Frankfurt and get them to send over a crate full of euros in a lorry each time. So there's branches of the ECB in each country that control the monetary supply in terms of printing currency. But in principle, I don't know how realistic this is, but this is one of the scenarios that's floated around. If the Greek government was facing mass, like 50% of people unemployed, people just starving due to the economic crisis, maybe they turn to the Greek branch of the ECB, which is staffed by Greek people, and say, start printing euros. Like we got to pay people. People need to eat. So that's another mechanism that could have triggered financial instability within the EU. So yeah, ultimately a compromise was reached, and that is in fact the end of my slideshow. I was right, that was the last slide. So hopefully you now have an understanding of why, not paradoxically, but perhaps confusingly, monetary policy, how we manipulate the flows of money and stuff, also affects international trade in a very concrete way. And when those two things do not align in an effective manner, they can bring down an otherwise healthy economy. And that's basically, as I said, this talk is mostly focused on the cons of a currency union. There are enormous positives that I have glanced over, which is unclear, for example, how much Southern European economies would have suffered, given that partially as a consequence of this, their imports have also been a lot cheaper for a very long time. So maybe their economy trajectory would have been, their growth would have been higher, but in an interim period of 20 to 30 years, that's just less goods that they can consume. That's less medicine, less materials for construction, less equipment, less, and all the stuff that you need to buy from other countries, So maybe with the more costly imports, they would have done even worse. Maybe the problems were more systemic. Maybe it was aging population, corruption, stuff like this, right? We don't know a counterfactual. We never lived in a world where the euro didn't exist. Also, it's worth pointing out a lot of other countries are pushing towards currency unions. So like the African Union I mentioned earlier wants to set up a currency union that covers all of Africa. And for them, the big incentive is financial stability. So an individual African country may not be particularly stable, I mean, actually, a lot of them are. A lot of what you know about Africa is about 15 years out of date for most people. I mean, if you've read up on it, you'll understand that Africa at this point is about 75% functioning democracies with fast-growing economies, but still there's a lot of political risks. You know, elections don't always go smoothly. Sometimes sectarian violence breaks out, stuff like this. This stuff tends to fluctuate. Currency valuation, which means that investors are always scared of investing in African countries, not because there isn't productive capacity there. There's an immense amount of talent and ingenuity and resources. Just like Africa is ripe for investment at this point. People are just waiting for it to become less financially risky in terms of currency fluctuations and stuff like that. So for the African Union, for them, it's a situation of, well, if we can get a currency union going across the whole of Africa, that's like, for all the mechanisms I just outlined, that's a much more stable country. Gambia has another rogue election where the incumbent won't leave power, fine, 1% fluctuation in the African Union currency, instead of the status quo, which is the Gambian currency falls through the floor and suddenly people can't buy food and medicine. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits to currency unions. I've mainly focused on the negatives because I think in some sense that's the more analytically rich stuff. And it's the stuff perhaps people understand less. I think most people can understand why being able to trade between two countries is probably a good thing. It's a little bit harder to understand the connection of monetary policy and trade and why those two things not working is a bad thing. At this point, I guess it's time to go. No, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, I don't think you can hear me, right?
Questions. I think I've answered these questions now. I think these questions are both covered. Oh, okay, no, sorry, Namita's question is unique. I do want to address this actually if the recording's still going, although Ala, tell me if I need to be cut off. Do I think that, or it's not going to be an answer on my behalf, it's going to be an answer based on what I've read and various academic sources and stuff, but do you think LDC is being forced to devalue their own currencies because the dependency on the global market can be viewed as a form of manipulation by countries with stronger currencies? Yeah, so it's complicated, right? Because it's unclear what the counterfactual is. Their currencies are typically weak because their economies have historically or recently been weak. What tends to happen actually for a lot of LDCs is that as their economies grow, these currencies start to go up. So it's not necessarily that way. But what tends to push them down actually in a lot of instances, it particularly affects like South American countries, a lot of Africa, is what I mentioned very briefly earlier, which is that a lot of trade happens in the US dollar. This can mean that currencies end up being devalued, not necessarily due to traditional mechanisms, but because people are opting into using the US dollar instead. It's a very complicated system, but there is some truth to the statement that a lot of countries have ended up with artificially low currency valuations relative to the US dollar. And this has basically allowed the US to purchase like massive amounts of stuff from other countries. In reality, what this has meant is that the US has basically purchased a lot of things that they don't want to produce in their own country. So you may have heard of like like South American countries becoming massively dependent on selling bananas to the USA. A more tangible one of this, and one that I think a lot has been written about, is the idea of like exporting ecological damage. So by having competitive exports for a lot of these LDCs means selling your natural resources basically. And as a consequence, the West has been basically able to outsource a lot of its necessary environmental damage, often humanitarian damage. Congo, as I said, it's 75% of the world's cobalt, and it's also a war zone in some parts of the country, and a lot of the cobalt mines are believed to basically run on child slave labor, and that's what powers our phones and our electric cars and everything else with a battery. It's a bit dodgy, and basically this is enabled by the fact that it's artificially cheap because these countries' currencies are devalued by often geopolitical turbulence. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about this stuff, though, so take what you read with a pinch of salt. These systems of international trade and monetary policy and stuff are far too complicated for a couple of men in suits in a shady room in the Federal Reserve to be manipulating the global economy. That's not really how this stuff works, but it's definitely systemic forces that have benefited people, even if they weren't intentional. Cool. So I'm going to read out the question because I don't know if this will show up on the recording. I'm a little hazy on how Spain has a weaker hold on the euro. I'm not sure what you mean by a weaker hold. How does this translate into export and deficit? I'm not sure what you mean by a weaker hold on the euro. So do you think you could rephrase that part? Because I'm not sure I understand the question otherwise. Okay, we can chat about this. I think I have you on Facebook. Yeah, let's chat about this on Facebook. I want to keep this recording from being too long. So yeah, Alo, if you want to cut the recording there.